The U.S. government could start to run out of money if Congress fails to raise the debt ceiling by the end of the month. Now, over the past 7 decades, the country's debt ceiling has been raised a whopping 78 times, including in 2011, when the delay in agreeing to a new limit resulted in the U.S. losing its coveted AAA credit rating, sparking an increase in borrowing cost. The current debt limit of $31.4 trillion was reached in January, but the Treasury Department took extraordinary measures to allow it to continue financing the government's activities. But a default, if it was to happen, would not have ramifications for the world's largest economy alone. So how will a U.S. default affect the rest of the world, especially African economies? Joining me now is Dr. Andrew Nevin. He's chief economist and partner at PwC Nigeria. I beg your pardon. Dr. Nevin, welcome to Business Edge. Thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, good morning. It's always great to be with you. I love Business Edge.
Thank you so much. So let's look at this, particularly with the Treasury situation for the U.S. market. So many consider that the U.S. Treasury market is the world's anchor asset. That's where so many people run. And if it turns out that this asset is actually not risk-free, which is the understanding, the sort of myth around, maybe not call it a myth, but the reality that's been around the U.S. Treasury market for a while, it could be a very, very messy situation. So starting from there, how would African economies be impacted if the U.S. Treasury market was to implode?
Let me just start out by saying for all the viewers today, the reason this situation arises is the U.S. has, in a sense, 2 contradictory legislations. I mean, Congress authorizes spending, and then the money's spent, and then they have a separate process that authorizes the debt ceiling. And when they come in conflict, so you've already spent the money, you've already authorized money by Congress, then you don't have the debt ceiling. You can't legally issue. You can't pay anymore. You can't legally issue any more debt. And they ran into that situation, as you said, about January. They've been moving things around a little bit, but they're running out of room on that. So we're going to hit it June 1st. Now, so what happened? Well, the last time we came to this kind of close situation, as you say, 2011, the U.S. lost its AAA status. And you essentially get another hike in interest rates. And we've seen massive hikes in interest rates around the world, particularly in the U.S. Dollar situation. People want to have to be paid more to hold on to treasuries, to hold on to T-bills. Africa has about, if I have the number right, about $775 billion of external debt, most of that in U.S. dollars. And so we would immediately be subject to another interest rate shock. Of course, interest rates have been rising, which has made it more expensive to deal with the debt, the U.S. dollar debt in this continent, and more countries are under debt pressure, as we know. This would accentuate that trend and that pressure.
So that pressure is where the conversation really is. So I want to talk about what Moody's Analytics also said, and that leads to what this could really mean for the U.S. economy. So they said that the U.S. would slide into recession, the GDP would fall by almost 4%, some 6 million jobs would be lost, driving unemployment rates up to 9% for the U.S., and the resulting shock market would sell off and erase around $15 trillion in household wealth. So in the short term, what they would see is interest rates would spike, and in the long term, they would probably never fall back to pre-default lows. So this really has the makings of a U.S. potential recession because of the politicking and the disagreements going on. But would we definitively see a global recession if we saw a U.S. recession?
Well, I mean, we may be heading to a recession anyway. I mean, as we know, economies are softening around the world. The U.S., this is very different than 2011. In 2011, the U.S. and a lot of the world was recovering from the great financial crisis of 2008, 2009. So the economies were growing stronger. We're already slowing down in the United States. And if we end up in this debt default situation, then I think that what you listed out exactly is what's going to happen. We'll definitely be in a recession in the United States. We'll definitely have a massive wipeout in terms of household wealth, and that has an effect on people's spending. We'll have a big increase in unemployment, and it'll rip them around the world. So, I mean, you can really see the stakes are high in Washington right now, and people need to understand why are they taking it to the limit. It's because the Democrats and the Republicans have a different view of the priorities. From the Republican viewpoint, they would like to see a path to reduce the government spending by about 18% over the next few years. 18% doesn't sound that big, except that you have to remember that they're not going to touch Social Security, they're not going to touch Medicaid, they're not going to touch Medicare, and they're not going to touch defense spending, which is about collectively almost 2/3 of the total spending, which means essentially that everything else that will be cut would have to be cut by about half. And that's where we've reached this kind of logjam. So for example, NASA would be cut by about half. National parks in the United States would be cut by about half. And that's what's driving us to the brink right now.
It's interesting you mentioned these cuts because some of these cuts were also done under the Trump administration as well. So it would even more just deepen what the Republicans have been trying to do for a number of years now. But when we come back to the African economies and this reliance we have on imports and exports from the U.S. to the U.S. and how much our economies are now globally tied, if we were to see a global recession, how would we fare on this side of things?
Well, the biggest impact on Nigeria, first off, we've seen with the oil price. Now, we haven't benefited from the increase in oil price because of essentially because of the collapse in production. I mean, you would think that with the invasion of the Ukraine and the oil price going over 100, still around $80, $85, Nigeria should be an oil economy. We should be benefiting. We're not benefiting. In fact, it's a drag on us because of the foil subsidy. So you take the collapse in the production. We're in the worst of all possible worlds. The collapse in production an increased oil subsidy. So we haven't got any benefit out of the increased oil prices. What's going to happen, of course, if we go into recession is oil prices will go down so that even if we start to increase production, which is a major part of the President-elect Tinubu's new administration's plan, we won't get the benefit because we'll see the drop in that. But I think an even bigger impact on this country would be through the reduction COVID period. I mean, we had very strongly growing remittances as we had the diaspora expanding because of the Japa effect, and also because people in the diaspora were becoming increasingly seniors. They were in longer positions, they were earning more money, they were sending more back. And of course, that all came to a halt in 2020 and 2021 because of the COVID and the impact on people's incomes, the diaspora incomes. If we went into a recession in the United States, I think we'd have the same impact here, where the growth in the diaspora remittances would come to a halt. So between the reduction in oil price negating the impact of increasing oil production under the new administration, and with the diaspora remittances dropping, it would have a big impact on us.
So let's talk about something else. We've also seen a strong U.S. dollar in the past several months, and that has really beaten down the majority of African currencies. If we were to see a default, what happens to the value of the dollar? And then what happens to African economies that use the dollar as a reserve currency?
Well, I mean, the U.S. dollar, as you say, has been very strong through the COVID period, and I think almost at a record high versus other major currencies on there. And effectively, it's a de facto world currency, particularly in Africa, where it's used a lot. I mean, the U.S. dollar would decline relative to other currencies for a period. I'm not quite sure the impact, if that would have a positive or negative impact on the economies here. I mean, I think that if we take Nigeria, for example, I mean, we've had weak macroeconomic fundamentals. We've had a big increase in Naira through many mechanisms, including the ways and means borrowing of the federal government from the CBN. So I think you'd continue to see, even if the dollar depreciated, you would continue to see the Naira depreciate against the dollar, which would mean the Naira versus the pound, the Naira versus the euro would be going down even faster.
All right, so let's talk about debts now, Dr. Nevin, because it's one of the biggest questions in this situation about how a U.S. default would impact African countries' ability to access international financial markets and even meet their debt obligations. We've had this conversation several, and we see what this year in 2024 is bringing for African economies when it comes to their debt calls or their debt obligations and payments that need to be made. So if there was to be a U.S. default, what are we looking at when it comes to debt sustainability or even just the debt conversation here on the continent? What impact would there be?
Well, as I said a little earlier, you're going to have an increase in interest rates. I mean, I don't know, 100, 200 basis points. Of course, not all your debt. There's $775 billion of external debt. Not all the debt immediately has that increase. It has to roll over. So, I mean, it might have an impact, extra $5 or $10 billion a year for Africa. But I think what's really important for people, though, to bear in mind is, I mean, there's the one equation, what we borrow and spend on. The question is, are we getting a return for the debt we take on? And if we look in the Nigerian case, we actually have a number of situations where we've taken on the debt and getting no return. So just a few examples. We have the $500 million US terminal in the international airport in Lagos. No value, it's not built in a way that can service the aircraft that are supposed to be using it. So $500 million debt with no return. We have the Abuja-Kaduna Railroad, I think about $700 or $800 million. Of course, we're not getting a return because it was built in a security situation that it can't actually deliver value. We continue to have massive spending at the Warri Port Harcourt, at Kaduna refineries. I can't even keep track of the numbers, and we're not getting a return, much of it in US dollars. And of course, we've taken on big debts in terms of our power sector, particularly from the World Bank, $750 million recently, the AFDB, the rural electrification program, I think, has taken another $400 million. It was reported $7.5 billion overall to support the power sector. So, and we're not getting a return there. So as much as 100 or 200 basis points would also have an impact, the bigger impact in this country is when we do these large projects, when we take these loans, are we getting any return for it? Unfortunately, there's too many projects where we borrowed the money, like the airport in Lagos, like the Kaduna Abuja Railroad. We borrowed the money and getting zero return, and it's just increasing the indebtedness. And now we've got that extra 100 to 200 basis points, or maybe more, that we'll be paying on that. So it just adds to the economic pain in the country.
All right, so you've mentioned the conversation around inflation, rising interest rates as well. There are some concerns about the potential of this of a default to hit supply chains, and whether or not this would differ so much from the consequences and disruptions caused by the Russia-Ukraine war. Do you think we're seeing some similarities with the potential of the default, or are these two really opposite situations that might just unfortunately be happening to the world around the same time?
Yeah, no, I don't think of all the impacts of the U.S. default that the supply chain disruption would be anything like what we saw with COVID and with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I mean, those were physical effects in the world. I mean, obviously COVID, production stopped, and so you couldn't export something. I mean, in terms of the U.S. dollar declining, interest rates going up, default on the payment of U.S. Treasury interest rates, those are financial matters, but I don't think they're going to have the same impact on the physical supply chains. But in general, I mean, the G7 just came out in Hiroshima and said, they use the term de-risk rather than decouple. And of course, I think if people follow closely, WTO, DG, and Ngozi just came out, of course, who's Nigerian's most globally well-known citizen, just came out and said, look, we need to move to more regional trading blocks anyway. We need to reduce the length of the supply chain. So I don't think, so that is the direction of travel. People are already saying that COVID taught us how risky it was to have these long-stretch supply chains, be dependent on one or two countries for key inputs. So, for example, there was a huge impact on car manufacturing through COVID because of just one chip not being able to go in the car, and only one or two countries producing that chip, or one or two producers of that chip. So I don't think the default of the U.S., if we come to that, is going to have that same impact as that. But as I said, I mean, WTO, DG, and Ngozi and others are saying, what we want to have is more regional supply chains. They're more resilient. When you have a stretched supply chain, when you depend on the whole global system working, something goes wrong, then it all comes to a halt. People may recall maybe 4 years ago now, there was one tanker stuck in the Suez Canal, which blocked the Suez Canal for 4 or 5 weeks. And that had a major impact on the global supply chain. How can you design a resilient supply chain that's dependent on one incident like that, bringing it to a global halt? So I think the direction of travel is in more resiliency, but I don't think the U.S. dollar default would have nearly the same impact as the physical manifestations of the war in Ukraine and COVID, or this tanker stuck in the Suez Canal.
Interesting enough. I think I agree with you on that. That's a very interesting point. So when we look at this in terms of mitigating the potential, Dr. Nevin, we've had these conversations. How can African economies try to sort of insulate themselves? We're also globally connected these days that there's so much, that one small thing, we're talking about the default here. We've spoken about zero COVID and how that impacted everyone. Is there any potential for African economies to sort of mitigate, insulate themselves from the potential impacts of a U.S. default, or have we become too interlinked for that to happen?
Well, I think if I take Nigeria example where I am, I mean, I think Nigerians are so resilient. Nigeria is so resilient. As I said, we'd have an impact on the diaspora remittances on that. But fundamentally, if we do the right, we can't control global events, and sometimes in the media, people say global events are causing our challenges here. And, I've been adamant that the challenges that we have, we can't control all events. And, we just need to do the right things that we can do in Nigeria. The number one thing in this context is, as I said a little earlier, is, I mean, yes, we could end up paying a bit more on our debt, but at least if we're getting value from the debt that we take on, like the airport, or the terminal in Lagos as an example, like the railroad, we can't do more of those projects where we take on hundreds of millions or billions of dollars of debt and get no return on it. So if we focus in the new administration on only doing infrastructure projects where we get a return, whether we pay 3% concessional rate, 5% higher rate, 7% of interest rates go up, I don't think it's so material as long as we're getting the return from it. So let's execute fewer projects to make sure that the projects that get done there's built-in maintenance, there's a real owner of the project who will make sure that it continues to deliver value. I mean, one of the things that I've always felt is backwards is we celebrate when something's commissioned. I think we should celebrate after it's been running for 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. That's when we get the value. So, today we're having the commissioning of the Dangote refinery, fantastic achievement. But you put $19 billion into this refinery. I mean, NMPC is a shareholder. The Saudis are now a shareholder. Many of the banks have loaned the Dangote Group money to be able to do this. So the nation is heavily invested in it. And the commissioning is important, but we actually haven't got any value out of it. What really we would want to celebrate in a few years is when the Dangote refinery is running at its 650,000 barrel per day capacity, and we're getting the return on it. So that would be my counsel. We can't fix the U.S. Debt default problem. All we can fix in Nigeria is focus on the fundamentals and make sure that the investments that we make are structured in a way that the country, the nation, and the capital providers in the nation and the people in the nation are getting a return for these investments.
And bringing up the Dangote refinery, we know that President Buhari, some few other African presidents and a lot of dignitaries right now are at the refinery to commission the project. But very quick question on that, because we've heard so much about the potential to solve Nigeria's diesel, kerosene consumption issues and even impact West Africa as well. Do you think we're getting our hopes up, or are we heading in the right direction? This is a private refinery. It's not Nigerian government owned. Yes, there's a stake in it, but this is a private enterprise, a private business. Are we putting too much pressure on the deliverables potentially of this refinery and what it means for the Nigerian economy and even the crude oil sector?
Well, I mean, the impact would be enormous. I don't think we're putting too much hope onto it. I mean, it's the world's largest refinery. It would supply all of the domestic needs if it was configured that way. Potential for export. Of course, we save all the cost of shipping crude oil out and refined product back in. Not only save that cost, but there's a lack of transparency, and it's been a source of corruption. Those oil for PMS swaps, oil for diesel swaps on that. I mean, but the refiner, of course, is not going to stop the end of the foil subsidy. It's not going to mean that PMS is available at subsidized price. That subsidy is coming off together. But it's coming off. It's definitely coming off in some period of time on that. I mean, all three presidential candidates said that. President-elect Tinubu has said it. His new administration has said it. So we're going to end the foil subsidy. So people aren't going to get the current PMS prices on that. But I do think it's a game changer. But as I said, the number one issue from my perspective and from the nation's perspective is it going to produce 650,000 barrels per day? I mean, today it's not producing anything right now. I mean, the commissioning is being done. I mean, I think we all recognize this because His Excellency President Buhari's term ends in 7 days, and he wanted a chance to acknowledge the tremendous effort on behalf of Mr. Dangote and his entire group and this project, which is incredible. But when we should be celebrating is when it's actually producing. And I think that should be monitored very carefully by people. And I hope 6 months, a year from now, 18 months from now, however long it takes to bring it up on all its various streams and products, we can really have a major celebration, because I do think it would have an enormous impact. It would also give real confidence that we could have these major infrastructure projects. I mean, global scale projects, $19 billion in this case, that got brought to completion successfully. But it's got to be producing product for us to have that celebration.
Before I let you go, there's meetings expected to happen today. We know Republicans walked out on Friday. There's been a lot of holdup, even to get U.S. President Joe Biden and Republican leader Kevin McCarthy to meet took some time. Janet Yellen is saying we only have weeks left before the U.S. may not be able to pay again. But do you think that the president and Republicans can reach some kind of agreement in the coming days, maybe 24, 36, 48 hours? What do you think it's going to be?
Yeah, I mean, I don't generally make predictions about the future, or especially about the future. But in this case, I think the signaling is that they're going to come closer together. I think the Republicans recognize, politically, the kind of cuts they're looking for are not really feasible, and Republicans like NASA too. So I think they'll find a compromise. But I've been through the 2011 one and a number of others earlier in my career where people bring it to the brink in the United States. So. Let's hope that we don't drop the President Trump strategy. So let's just default on everything, because I do think that would have major ramifications for it. But I'm optimistic they'll reach a compromise sometime in the next week or two.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Andrew Nevin, Chief Economist and Partner at PwC Nigeria. U.S. defaults, how we impact Africa, particularly the largest economy here on the continent, Nigeria as well. And we'll keep our eyes peeled, and whatever decisions are reached, I'm sure we'll be talking to you sometime soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right.